Everyone to Daf Yomi 1 week at a time, Masechet Batra. Today is our 12th class, and we are going to be reviewing Daf 79 through 85. Today we're going to start on the topic of Me'ila, not as in Me'il, a coat, but Me'ila, which means misappropriating sanctified objects. It would basically be, right, stealing from God, right? So if something is sanctified, it's made kadosh. A person is not allowed to use it because it was sanctified for the use in the temple. And there are different levels of this sanctification, whether it's going to be a sacrifice or whether it means that it's going to be used, just monetarily. But either way, it has, you're not allowed to use it. A regular person is not allowed to use it. So Daf 79 tells us that if anything is made kadosh, right, if it's sanctified, of bedek habayit. Bedek habayit means it's going to be used for the upkeep of the temple, not for a sacrifice, but for maintenance. So these things plus anything inside of them is subject to me'ila, right? And that's the reason we're bringing this up is if you remember, we ended last week with the Mishnah that speaks about, right, like if you sell the pit, the cistern, the water comes with it, right? If you sell the beehive, the bees come with it. So what's the power of this, different these different objects that hold other things? So therefore, not only in a sale, but also if you sanctify, right, like the area of the garbage dump, so then the manure that's there becomes sanctified. The same thing, if you sanctify the pit, the cistern, you sanctify the water. But that's only if the water was in the cistern at the time that you sanctified it. But if you sanctified the cistern and then only later it was filled with water, so then the cistern is subject to me'ilah, but the water isn't. Or another opinion is that even if it's filled up later, it's still subject to me'ilah. And here, so now the same thing with the dovecote and the birds, right? Or if the tree, right, you sanctified a tree and then it grew fruit, all of those things become sanctified. Okay, maybe there's a difference between, right, a field and a tree that are going to grow later, as opposed to things that are already in that object to begin with. Okay, right. So, and then there's a question: if something grows from something that is kadosh, is the thing that grows kadosh as well? Is it sanctified? So that is actually a machloket, but everybody agrees that the pit and then you filled up the water later, that is not kadosh. It's not sanctified. Or, of course, the Gemara says the opposite. Maybe the machloket is with the pit and the dovecote, but everybody agrees that for the tree and the field, that if the tree grows fruit, if fruit grows from the tree, that it is sanctified, even if it grows later. Okay. Again, so now the Gemara says again, if you sanctify something that is empty, so then it doesn't have the power to sanctify something if you fill it up afterwards, or it can. And this, of course, is another machloket we've seen previously, which is, can you sanctify something that doesn't exist right now? Right? And the famous case is a woman says, everything that I'm going to make with my hands, I sanctify. So the question is, can she do that or not? Right? Or everything that grows from this tree is going to be sanctified. Right now, it's not there. So how can you sanctify something that doesn't exist? And again, that's a machloket. if it works or if it doesn't. Okay, or maybe there's a difference, right? That that the fruit is going to grow on the tree, but you don't necessarily know that water is going to be put into the cistern. So maybe that is the issue, and maybe it is okay. Okay, and then so now Daf 80, we have a new Mishnah. So the Mishnah tells us that if you buy basically the birds from the dovecote, so you have to allow the first pair that are born. Well, we'll see. We have to let the first pair stay with the mother, and then subsequent babies that are born, you're allowed to take or sell. The Gemara says that basically, right, the Gemara is going to explain that basically the dove gives birth every month, and then right it gives birth and then it mates, right? The baby mates, and then they have a child. They start their own family. So again, if you buy the baby birds, you can't buy all the babies because the mother, and it's just fascinating, like the psychological aspect, right? So the Mishnah teaches us that the mother bird needs company in order to have more babies. Therefore, you have to leave at least one pair, right, with her, and then you can take the other babies. Similarly, with a beehive, that if you buy the honey or the honeycomb, if you buy the bees, so you only get 3 swarms, and we'll see what this means. If you buy the honeycomb, you need to leave at least 2 honeycombs in the beehive for the other bees to be able to eat. And if you buy an olive tree for its wood, you have to leave at least 2 branches on the tree, or a certain amount of the tree, so that the tree can regenerate. So now the Gemara explains. You need to leave. We said we have to leave a pair of birds for the mother. Now the Gemara says you actually have to leave 2 pairs of birds. Right, the mother needs company, and then the daughter also needs company. Right, because if you're going to sell her babies, so she needs company. And then again, like this is like you can do a doctorate on this, I think, on this daf. So then the Gemara says, wait a minute, the mother needs the daughter, and now you're saying the daughter needs another daughter. Why can't you say, oh, the mother's still there, so why isn't that enough for the daughter? Why does the daughter need her daughter? So the Gemara says that the daughter needs her daughter to feel safe, and that the mother is not enough. So I think it's just fascinating to think about what the Gemara is trying to say here, but definitely that there's a very deep connection between mothers and daughters. Okay, we said bees after 3 swarms. So then the owner can stop the bees from reproducing, right? So I guess the idea is that when do the bees keep reproducing, and when can you stop? And then if you're stopping them from reproducing, how are you doing that? So the Gemara says, well, if you give them mustard, so then the honey is going to be bitter, and then either they eat their own honey and they don't have time and they don't have children, but somehow the mustard stops them from having children. If you remember, I don't remember if it was this Masachet or Bava Metzia, but we did talk about, I think it was last Masachet, the neighbors, right? One neighbor has bees and the other has mustard, and we said like they have to distance, or maybe it was this Masachet, they have to distance themselves from each other because it's bad for both of them, or maybe it's just bad for the bees. Anyway, so here is where we see that it's bad for the bees. Okay, honey in the beehive is considered right, food for the bees, and therefore you have to leave some of the honeycomb for the bees to eat, and you can sell the rest of the honeycomb. Okay, so and then since we're talking about a beehive, we actually had this previously. The beehive is like property, it's like land, right? Because it's called a forest of honey in a verse. Therefore, you can't take honey out of it on Shabbat because it's as if you're harvesting, it's as if you're pulling it from the ground, even though it's not attached to the ground. Honey that comes out of the hive is not seen as food or drink. And again, as we said, 2 of the honeycombs need to stay for the bees, and you have to leave that there. Okay, hold on 1 second. Okay, now let's say you buy a tree for the wood, right? There's 2 reasons you would buy a tree. One is for the fruit, and one is for the wood, or also I guess for beauty, but here we're talking about for the wood. So then we said you have to leave a certain amount of the stump to let it regenerate, right? The idea is you're cutting off either branches or the trunk, but different, the Gemara discusses different types of trees and how much you need to keep in order for the tree to be able to regenerate after you cut some of it down. On Shemitah, right, again, when you're not supposed to be doing anything with the land, you can't cut a tree down if it's good for the tree. If it's not good for the tree, so then it's okay. So the Gemara asks, how much do you have to leave? Right. So if you leave 3 tfachim, so then it's good for the tree. If you cut it really like flush with the ground, that's bad for the tree. And if it's between flush and the ground and 3 tfachim, it's not bad, but it's not good. So we have a little bit of both. A palm tree or a cedar tree, you can cut flush with the ground because either way, they're not going to regenerate. And therefore you can cut them down if you need to cut them down. And then the Gemara brings up one of my favorite psukim, right? Tzadik katamar yifrach, ke'erez balvanon yiskeh, right? The righteous are compared to a palm tree, a date palm, a tamar, and they're also compared to a cedar from Lebanon. And now the Gemara says, why do we need to compare a righteous person to a palm tree, which is called a tamar, and to a cedar? Why do you have to compare to both? Because each one has pros and cons, right? So the cedar tree, doesn't have children, meaning it doesn't have fruit, but it can regenerate. Don't worry, we just said that cedar trees cannot regenerate. The Gemara is going to bring that up in a minute. As opposed to the tamar, right, has children, right, has a lot of fruit, but it does not regenerate, right? So we want to make sure that the righteous person is compared to both types of trees, one that can regenerate and one that has children, right, that is productive. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, you just contradicted yourself. You said that cedar trees regenerate, but then you said that they don't. So the Gemara says, you're right. There are 10 types of cedar trees. Some of them regenerate and some of them don't.
Amen.
Thank you. Okay, Daf 81. So the Mishnah tells us that if you buy 2 trees, and we've actually seen this before, but this is the source. If you buy 2 trees in someone's field, you do not get the land. You just get the trees. Or, of course, there's another opinion that you do get the land. But let's say you don't get the land. So then if the trees grow too much and they start shading onto the neighbor, right, or the owner's land, so then the seller is not allowed to touch the trees. He's not allowed to trim the trees. If a branch grows out of the trunk, so that belongs to the owner of the tree. But if a shoot grows out of the roots, so then that belongs to the owner of the land. Even though it's attached, right? It's part of the original tree, because it's coming out of the roots, it's seen as a different tree. And if one of the trees dies, you don't have rights to the land, meaning if the tree dies, you can't uproot it and plant another tree because you just bought the tree. You didn't buy the rights to the land. However, if you bought 3 trees, so then you do get the land. We'll see what land you get, but you get the land around the trees. And if it grows into the seller's land, the seller can trim it. And if a branch grows out of the roots, it belongs to the owner of the tree, because again, not only does he have the rights to the tree, but also the land right next to it. And if it dies, he has the right to plant another tree on that land. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to explain if you bought 2 trees. So, and this is great because this is this week's Parsha. In this week's Parsha of Ki Tavo, we have the mitzvah of Bikurim. Right? Bikurim are the first fruit that were brought to the temple on Shavuot, or around Shavuot. And when you brought these first fruits to the temple, they were given as a gift to the temple. And you would say certain verses. Those verses, actually, we say them in the Haggadah on Pesach. But we're going to see in a minute, the Torah says that who's going to say these verses? Anybody who's bringing the first fruit from their land. Now, because it's connected to land, only a person who owns the land, not just the tree, can say these verses. And if not, so then he can't. So now the Gemara is going to speak this out. So if you bought 2 trees, so you can bring bikurim, you bring the first fruit, but you don't say the verses, because again, the verses imply that you own the land, and you don't own the land, therefore you cannot say the verses. Okay, but okay, so maybe so the Gemara talks about this issue of bringing fruit if you're not sure if you should or not, because again, you own the tree, but you don't own the land. Okay, but then the Gemara says that saying the verses isn't critical, meaning you can bring the bikurim and not say the verses. That is okay, and therefore you can bring it, and you don't say the verses. There's actually an interesting principle on this daf, on the bottom of daf 81, which is that if you can do something, then I'll say it, right? As long as you could do an action, certain action that has to do with the temple, then maybe if you don't do it, it's okay. Meaning, if I create a situation where I physically cannot do that action, so then it's void because you can't do it. But if you could do it, if you don't do it, it's okay. That was a little complicated, but but the idea is that certain actions, you have to have the ability to do them, but they aren't necessarily critical. That's what I wanted to say. If you don't have the ability to do them, so then it invalidates the ceremony or the process, right? So again, in our case, you're bringing the bikurim, but you're not saying the verses. And those verses are not necessarily critical for bringing the fruit. Okay. And the Gemara tells us about bikurim. It says that you have to take take the fruit and bring it to Jerusalem. Therefore, you need to take the fruit from the ground and bring it to the temple. And that has to be done by the same person, meaning the person who harvested, meaning the owner of the fruit, needs to bring it to the temple. And therefore, you're not allowed to say it. So you're not allowed to send it with a messenger. You have to bring it up yourself. Um, um, and then the question is, why can't you just say the verses? Like, what does it matter? Like, it's just saying psukim. It's not like you're doing any action. What's so bad about saying verses if you don't need to? So the Gemara explains on Daf 82, because if you say it, it implies that you brought the fruit from your land and you didn't bring it from your land. Or you might think that you don't need to separate Trumot and Masrot, again, because we're not sure if this is really Bikurim, and therefore we make sure that you don't say the verses, so you realize this is different, and then you realize that you still need to separate Trumot and Masrot from this fruit. Okay, we talked about the branches growing from the trunk versus from the roots. So what happens, the Gemara asks, if the dirt shifts and covers the base of the branch, right? Let's say the branch came out from the trunk, but now, right, the dirt shifted and it looks like it's coming out of the dirt. And then the buyer says, no. Remember, he bought 2 trees, but now there's this shoot. So now it looks like there are 3 trees. So the buyer says, oh, look, you sold me 3 trees. I get all the land. So the Gemara says, you're right. Therefore, you have to cut down these branches that come out of the trunk because we don't want somebody to trick the other person saying that really I bought three trees, even though he only bought 2 trees. And from here back to our palm tree, and we have said this previously, that the palm tree actually does not have a trunk, right? It's really just the shoots and then like the dead leaves. And therefore, you can't keep any growth of the palm, right? It doesn't regenerate, as we said before as well. Let's say the person bought a tree for 5 years. So even, right, just the tree, but he bought it for 5 years. Even if it dies, he is allowed to replace it because he bought a tree for 5 years. So as long if there's no tree there, he can plant another one there. Okay, so now we said, wait, now we have a picture. Thank you to the art scroll. Can you see the picture? Okay, so here the Gemara tells us that if you bought 3 trees, you get the full field. So what does that mean? You get the under the tree, right? The land that's under the tree and in between the trees, and even some of the land around the outside of the tree. And this is the space for the picker and his basket. Again, these are presumably fruit trees. So we want to make sure that he gets the area around. But he doesn't get a path to the trees, right? That he has to buy. Because again, it's a different property. So maybe he also doesn't get the black, right? Maybe he doesn't get the outside of the trees. The Gemara says, no, he gets that because he needs to be able to harvest his tree and all around each tree. But if he bought 2 trees, so he does get a path because he doesn't get the property, so then he does get a path to his tree. And again, here is the discussion we've had previously when a person sells, when they sell their property, do they do it generously, ba'ayin yafa, or do they do it ba'ayin ra'ah, meaning not generously? Okay. Okay, now the Gemara asks, who can plant in the area around the trees? Um, so, um, so the Gemara answers, the seller is allowed to plant, but meaning the owner of the field is allowed to plant around the trees, but the owner of the trees can walk through that area, right? Again, as we said, the owner of the tree needs to be able to get to his trees. But the tree owner can say, listen, your plants are getting like all my fruit dirty. I don't want your whatever. I don't want you to plant whatever you planted underneath the trees, right when they fall. And therefore the Gemara concludes that really neither of them should plant like on the path or like too close to the tree, but really around the tree, the owner of the field is allowed to plant. The space between the trees needs to be there's a minimum and a maximum, right? So here you see our triangle. What's the minimum, right? How close can they be and how far can they be? So one opinion is they need to be at least 4 amot apart, but if they're more than 8, then they're not seen as one field. It's just seen as 3 very separate trees. Or it's instead of 4 to 8, the other opinion is 8 to 16, right? And therefore it can't be closer than that and it can't be further than that. And now the Gemara tries to decide which one is true, 4 to 8 or 8 to 16. So we're going to now discuss the topic of kilaim, right? So if you remember, kilaim is planting 2 species together, and more specifically, it's planting grain in a vineyard, right? So you have vines growing, and then you are not allowed to plant grain, but really any seeds in that vineyard. Now, in kilaim, there's a discussion there's a differentiation between a vine and a vineyard, right? Meaning a field of grapevines has one rule and a singular vine has a different rule. So if you just have a vine, you only need to separate 6 tfachim, 6 handbreadths, and then you can plant your grain. But if you have a vineyard, so then, and a vineyard is 5 vines, they actually have to be in a certain formation, which is 2, 2, and then 1 at the bottom or at the top, like so, kind of looks like a house. But if you have 5 vines, then it becomes a vineyard, and then you have to go 4 amot, right? So 6 tfachim is very small, 4 amot, right, is much wider. So again, we want to understand what creates a vineyard and what doesn't. So if you have rows of vines that are 16 amot apart from each other, it is not a vineyard, right? So that seems to be a proof for 8 to 16, right? Because more than 16, it's not a vineyard. And therefore you can plant much closer to those vines. And then there's a story about a person who, I have a picture of this. What they did was, hold on, they planted, you can look, they planted their vines, right? You see row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those were vines. But what they did was they bent the vines towards each other, and then, right? So then, right, 1 and 2 are now closer together, as opposed to the area between 2 and 3. That's going to be wider, right? Because there are no grapes in between 2 and 3, and therefore he plowed that field in between, and he was able to plant in area B and D, right? So I hope you can see it. So that's was like so the Gemara talks about this was like a good trick, that if you did this, you could plant in between those two rows. And the sages said that it was okay. All right, Daf 83 tells us about 3 trees within 8 amot of each other. So then you get the land. So that seems to be a proof for 8 to 16. But you also get 4 amot to work the trees around it. And therefore, it also seems to be saying 4 to 8. So now the Gemara tells us that if a vineyard is 8 by 8, the vines are not seen as a vineyard, right? They're seen as too far apart. This is a proof for 4 to 8, not 8 to 16. And therefore, if it's less than 4 amot, it's also not a vineyard. Or there is an opinion that we say that the middle one, we see it as if it's not there, and then it is a vineyard. Okay, so the Gemara says, what is the halacha? What's the rule? The rule is that it's the minimum is 4. If they're closer together than 4, it's not a vineyard. And the maximum is 16. So we basically combined the two opinions, right? We had 4 to 8, 8 to 16, and instead we said 4 to 16. So the maximum is 16 and the minimum is 4. Okay, now the Gemara asks, where do you measure from, right? If you all know, right, as any kindergarten kid can tell you, when you draw a tree, right, you draw a tree like this. What does that mean? The bottom of the trunk is wider, right? As opposed to if you go higher up, it becomes more narrow. So if we're talking about distance between trees, where do we measure from? So the Gemara says, do we measure from the widest part or from the narrowest part? I'm sure you can figure it out. What are we going to say? Oh, somewhere in the middle, right? So the Gemara says at the second knot, that is the middle of the tree. That's where that's like the average width of the trunk, and that's where you're going to measure your trees. Okay, let's say you have one tree and then 2 shoots of the tree. So then it looks like 3 trees. And this is actually, and then the question is, do we view it as 3 trees or 1 with 2 shoots? So the Gemara is going to answer teku to all of these questions, meaning we don't know the answer to the questions. But there is an issue of maybe if those shoots have their own, if they have their own root system, so then we see them as separate trees. Let's say you have 2 trees in a field, and then a 3rd tree on the border, which is, it's still part of the field, but it's also a little bit different because it's usually on a raised area. Is it seen as 3 trees, and do you get the land in between or not? Or let's say you sold 2 trees in one field and then 1 tree in somebody else's field. You happen to own a tree in someone else's field. Do you get the land in between? And then again, the Gemara says, teku. Okay, let's say you have something that divides these 3 trees, right? So you have 1 tree here and 2 trees there, and then let's say there's a stream in the middle, or a palm tree in the middle, or a highway going through the middle. Again, the Gemara says teku. Let's say you have a cedar tree in the middle of, here we can go back to our other picture, right? So we're discussing this, right? So let's say another tree grows in the middle. Do you get to keep it or not? So the Gemara says, obviously, if it grew in your field, then you own it. The question is, if it was there before, when he bought the land, right, he gets it or not. And then the Gemara asks, we're talking about 3 trees, and we automatically drew this triangle. But here the Gemara asks, these 3 trees, are they in a row or are they in a triangle? Right? And each one has pros and cons, right? So if it's in a row, then for sure, with a triangle, you get the land in between. But if you say, if the opinion who says triangle, he doesn't necessarily agree to if it was in a row. Okay, next Mishnah, you sell, okay, so this is talking about sales. Again, remember, we're selling different things, and we're going to talk about things that are important in and of themselves, and things that are maybe less important, so maybe they're included in the sale, right? Like we had before, the birds with the dovecote, the bee with the beehive. So now, if you sell a head of a large animal, you don't get the feet. And if you sell the feet, you don't get the head. This is speaking about a cow, right? The cow's feet, I think, is a delicacy. So if you buy the feet, you don't get the head, and vice versa. Each one is seen as important. The same thing with the lungs and the liver, right? Whatever you buy, that's what you get. You don't get anything bonus. But in a small animal where some of these things are seen as less important, right? So if you buy the head, you do get the feet, right? It comes together. And if you, right, but if you buy the feet, you don't get the head. If you buy the lungs, you get the liver. But if you buy the liver, you don't get the lungs. From here, we're going to talk about different types of sales. And if you remember, we had the concept of ona'ah. Ona'ah means fraud. Usually it's talking about either overcharging or undercharging. But here we're going to talk about not holding up your side of the bargain and what are the ramifications. So let's say you said you were going to sell this person good wheat. And then when you delivered it, it was inferior wheat. So then the buyer is allowed to back out of the sale, not the seller, but the buyer. Let's say you said, I'm going to sell you inferior, and you gave him superior. Only the seller is allowed to back out because, right, he made a mistake, or maybe. Let's say you said you promised superior and you delivered superior. Nobody's allowed to back out. And if you promised red wheat and then you delivered white wheat, right, or like one type of wood, but then you delivered a different type of wood, or vinegar as opposed to wine, this is what's called a mekach ta'ut. It's a invalid sale, and both of them can back out because you didn't get what you paid for. Okay, so now we're going to talk about acquiring small object or acquiring objects. Right, so let's say the seller sold something that had a value of 5 for 6. This is ona'ah. It's called price fraud, and you have to give it back or give back the money. But let's say then the value went up to 8. So now the buyer is the one who can retract the sale. The seller cannot. Right? Because again, the buyer can say, now that you cheated me, you can't back out of this sale, right? You could have backed out if you didn't cheat me in the first place, but now it's too late. Daf 84, you sold something that was the value of 6 for 5, but now the value is 3. Only the seller is allowed to back out, not the buyer, because again, of the original fraud. Both cases in the Mishnah seem to be, right, superior versus inferior grain. And you might have thought that if the value changes, then both of them can back out. And then the Gemara says, no, only the one who's frauded is allowed. I don't know if that's a verb, but who is who is cheated. So then he can retract the sale. Remember we said red versus white. This teaches us, the Gemara says, this teaches us that the sun is really red. And right, based on the word for red here, and that in the morning and the evening the sun is red. And now just a little like a gadita. Why is the sun red in the morning? Not anything to do with particles in the atmosphere, but because it passes by the rose garden in Gan Eden. Right, Gan Eden is to the east, and therefore it gets red. Why is it red at sunset? Because it is passing over Gehenom, right, the fiery hell, and therefore it is red. Okay, wine versus vinegar. Again, one would think these are the same species, and then the Gemara says no, it's two different species, and therefore you cannot. It is seen as different, and you can invalidate the sale. Okay, last Mishnah for today. If you sell fruit and you agreed on a price, so and then the buyer does mishicha. If you remember, mishicha we learned last week means that you pull it towards you. But you didn't measure it yet. You still acquire it. It does work. It's a valid acquisition. Let's say the seller measured, but the buyer didn't pull anything. He didn't do anything. So there's no sale till the buyer does an action. So then the Mishnah says, if a buyer is smart, he can rent the location of wherever the produce is, and then he acquires the produce without doing anything, right? He doesn't have to lift a finger. And if you buy flax, you have to do mishicha, but if it was attached to the ground, if you just detach a few of them, so then you acquired the whole either the harvest or whatever you agreed upon. So now the Gemara is going to explain, if the seller measured the produce and put it in the alleyway for the buyer, so that is a valid sale, even though the buyer didn't pull anything towards him. Maybe only if he put it in the vessel of the buyer, then it becomes the buyer's. The Gemara says, no, obviously, if you put it in the basket of the buyer, obviously he acquires it. So the Gemara didn't have to teach it in that sense. Let's say the person put it on the floor, right? There's no utensil. So then he acquires it by putting it on the floor. Okay. If the seller measured and the buyer didn't do mishicha, he didn't pull it, so then there's no sale, because again, the buyer didn't acquire the item yet. This is only in the public domain. Misira, so we actually said this, if you remember last week, I think, with the boat, right? Misira, when you hand something over, that works in the public domain, but mishicha, pulling it, only works in an alleyway, and hagbaha, lifting something up, is an acquisition anywhere, wherever you go. If he did mishicha from the public domain to the alleyway, so then it's a valid kinyan, it's a valid acquisition. If you're, again, now the Gemara is going to discuss, where are you standing? If you're standing in the domain of the seller, the buyer can rent the land where the produce is, and then he acquires the produce. Okay, last offer today, 85. A person's vessel, a person's kli, can acquire something for him anywhere except for a public domain, because the public domain is owned by no one, right, or everyone, right? And why? Because then it's not considered his property. Or maybe if you go to the alleyway, which, as we mentioned before, the alleyway can be seen as private property, even though it's right off the public property. Okay, now the Gemara says there are 4 levels of a sale, right? Before the utensil, again, use it as like the shopping cart or the right the bag that you're filling up your, I don't know, cherries, right? So you're putting in a little bit at a time. So before the bag is full, so then the sale isn't final. When the bag is full, so then it belongs to the buyer. However, it's only if neither one of them owns the bag, like the utensil. But if one of them owns it, so then as he fills it up, he acquires it, right? So if I bring my own reusable bag to the supermarket, as soon as I put the produce in my bag, it becomes mine. So then the Gemara says, wait a minute, really? So we say, yes, if you're in the public domain. But if you're in the seller's domain, right? Let's say you're driving down and you see like a farmer's market and it's the farmer this is his farm. He's selling his produce. So now you come. How do you acquire his produce? You're standing in his field. So the only way to acquire it is by hagbaha, right? Lifting it up, right? When you lift it up, so then it becomes yours. Or you can take it off the property, right? As soon as you take it out off of the land, so then it becomes yours. If it's in the buyer's domain, so then as soon as the seller decides to sell it, so then it becomes the buyer's. Okay, right? Let's say you have the buyer's utensil in the seller's property. So can that acquire the object for the buyer? So we actually learned from get. If you remember, we discussed with get that if the husband throws the get and it lands right near the wife, so then, hold on one second, I lost my place. So right, if you throw it into her basket, so then she acquires it. So then the question is, where is she sitting? Presumably she's sitting in her husband's property. So the Gemara says, no, maybe the box needs to be attached to her physically, and that's how she acquires it, not by it falling into her basket. Maybe we're only speaking about the seller's utensil in the seller's property. And right, it was more common to use the utensil of the person who owned the property, right? Who's going to give out the bags? The farm, because they want you to buy. Now, let's say if you did Mashicha, right, you pulled a donkey, you don't acquire the things that are on his back, right? Like all the things in the bags. And therefore, both people are allowed to back out of the deal because it's not finalized. The top of 86, but if you unloaded all the things into the buyer's house, so if you set a price, but you didn't measure it, so then neither can change the deal. And when you agree on the price, it shows finality of the sale, and therefore neither of them can back out of it. Okay, with that, we are going to end for tonight. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I know Lisa loves anything that has to do with trees and plants.
Oh my God, I have to share. I'm starting to vibrate inside. I'll be quick. First I want to say I didn't read Batra because I don't have it, but I have Bava Mitzvah. So I started reading it. It's like I'm reading a 4th grade book. But now I appreciate what you have done over the years, and you have squashed all these pages into 5 minutes. It's amazing. Secondly, this is a true story. At the Chabad house, there was a palm tree growing. So the landscaping people came and they cut it off and broke my heart. So I went away and I came back 3 months later. Now that this palm tree that you said wouldn't grow if you cut it, the Mishnah said it wouldn't grow if it's cut at the ground. It's 4 feet tall. That's
wow.
True. I know.
Maybe it was a shoot. Maybe it was like something growing from like the roots.
No, it had water, I guess. I had to have water to grow that fast. The other thing, you remember when you said you were measuring from the knots on the tree?
Yeah.
We still, those knots are caused by pretty good sized branches, if you can see them, you know. We
Right.
still do that today. We measure a tree. How big is the tree? At breast height.
Oh, cool.
That is a
Okay.
carryover, and I thought you'd find that interesting.
Very interesting. Also, by the way, Bava Batra, you can find it online if you wanted
That's
to
what I'm
read
going to
it.
do. I'm just going to
It's
go look
also
for it because I
online.
want to do the stories. I want to read the
Yeah.
stories.
Okay, go look at those stories. Any other questions or comments?
So I had a quick comment about the mother bird. Can't ever leave that alone.
Yeah.
So this now talking about the leaving a daughter, and then so I am assuming that they really aren't specifying the gender, male or
True.
female.
I
They're
don't
not
think so.
really, because if I'm
Right.
taking all these chicks, I really can't tell what's what.
True. True. So we can say
Not at that
child.
age.
We can say child. Uh, well, actually, it's interesting. The truth is, now that I'm thinking about it, it is probably thinking about gender because, again, what's the point? You want to make sure that the daughter has a daughter so that the daughter can lay eggs.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that it's the female that
Mhm.
you're leaving. You know, so I think it is actually the daughter now that I'm thinking about
Well,
it.
it also said she needed a comforter, and the
Right.
son will comfort her as well. He's still a baby,
That's true.
but she just wants
Well,
a baby,
That's
and
true.
he's going to go get married, so he's going to have more
that's
babies
right.
too.
And when it
That's true.
says, and to the boy, it says, and you shall leave your mother and father, and you shall cleave to her, and they shall be one flesh. So they're not quite as close. It's different.
Yes, and maybe the baby boy is gonna fly the coop, as they say.
Yeah.
And but yeah, it is interesting. I think it's just fascinating psychologically, and also like I feel like they really do know what they're talking about. You know, like I think they were very in tune with nature. So it is interesting to think about. You know, if you separate the mother and the daughter, does the mother stop laying eggs? I do not know enough about this, but that's what it seems to be implying.
And
So
here's a fun one, and then I'll leave and be quiet. My mother was building a house on the Oregon coast, and a baby bird had just been born in the nest. She stopped construction at $1,000 a day until that baby bird grew up and flew off.
wow, that's commitment.
Was she
That's a mother committed to another baby, not even her baby. That's love.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.
Oh, Shabbat.
And Ezrat Hashem, we will pick it up next week.
Don't you say Lashana Tova now?
We could. Shana Tova. I do have to think about in 2 weeks. I think it's already Rosh Hashanah, so I have to think about. I guess we'll do it the day before. I have to look at the calendar. But next
October
week, regular, and sure, we can say Shana Tova.
Okay.
So Shana Tova and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.